The report. We move on to the finance report. Paul.
Thank you, Malcolm. So the report you have in front of you sets out the latest financial performance data for the commissioning system and our forecast for the remainder of the year. It is hot off the presses, so I haven't on this occasion got to do that rather difficult task of describing the month 5 numbers with you looking at the month 4 numbers in front of you, so you have the numbers that I have. And as the paper notes, probably more importantly perhaps than the numbers themselves, we're just in the middle of an in-depth stock take with regional and local teams to achieve really 3 things. Firstly, to test the robustness of what's essentially a balanced forecast position for the commissioning system as a whole that you have in front of you. Secondly, to understand the interventions already underway across the country to manage what's clearly a higher level of risk than we've seen in previous years. And thirdly, to agree any further actions that we need to take to ensure that we sustain our 100% track record, so far at least, of living within our means. The report highlights, I think, the reasons why this is more difficult this year. Essentially, we've had to increase the level of commissioner efficiencies by nearly 50% overall, and more than that in the CCG sector, in order to create the headroom for the 1% investment and risk reserve that we are holding this year. And our success in managing the risks I've talked about, and equally I would say NHS Improvement's success in minimising the deficit in the provider sector, is therefore essential if we're going to secure that financial balance and, equally important, maximise the proportion of the reserve that I've just talked about, which can be invested locally in support of our 5-year forward view priorities, rather than being released to offset overspends. It's also important for another reason, which Simon mentioned already, which is to set the right starting point for the operating plans that we discussed earlier in this meeting, which require both the commissioning sector and the provider sector together, but also individually, to be in financial balance next year. And clearly, to the extent that we don't achieve that this year through the measures that we're talking about, the task for next year becomes even more significant. Perhaps just one parenthesis. So given the ongoing speculation in various quarters, it's perhaps just worth reminding ourselves of Simon's comment back in June, which is still very much valid, that there is no realistic prospect of some external solution coming for all these problems, external funding or whatever, in the next few months or indeed the next few years. So all of us, CCGs, NHSEngland and the provider community, need to be planning and then delivering the financial balance within the resources that we've got available now, rather than waiting for some deus ex machina solution that simply will not be forthcoming over the next few months. And if we defer taking the robust action that we need to take now in order to see whether that might possibly happen, it will be too late by the time that we discover that that isn't a realistic prospect. So that's the task in hand. Appendix A in the report you have in front of you shows you how things are going so far. We are, as I say, forecasting what's effectively a break-even position on the bottom line, a slight overspend of 24 million, less than 0.1%, which is, frankly, well within the roundings on a 106 billion budget at this stage of the year. But you can also see that the challenges which I've just described are already evident in the delivery of the CCG sector, with year-to-date overspends in just over a third of the CCG population, totalling 159 million. If you cast a quick eye across to Appendix D, you can see that that correlates strongly with the shortfalls in the delivery of commissioner efficiencies. But again, I just remind you that that's against a much higher level of ambition than in previous years. The year-to-date performance shown in Appendix D is running at 85% of plan amongst CCGs, but it still represents a 23% increase over the equivalent period last year. It's also noticeable that by way of contrast with previous years, the pressure amongst CCGs is being felt across the whole country, with CCGs in the north in particular now having to adjust to budgets which are closer to their target allocations. As usual, spending on central budgets has got off to a relatively slow start, so the commissioning overspends you can see in the year-to-date position have been partially offset at least by slippage in NHSEngland running and programme costs. But the big question for us is how much of the commissioning position can be recovered by the end of the year. The current forecasts, as you can see, show that in most regions, CCGs are expecting to see significant improvements in financial performance over the coming months. If they achieve that, we can offset the residual overspend by a variety of one-off factors shown in the forecast, particularly relating to rates rebates, and by holding back spending against our central budgets. and even allowing for the oddities of Treasury accounting, which was reflected in the adjustments towards the bottom of the table, we have a clear line of sight to a balanced position. Paragraphs 15 and 16 of my report, though, set out the risks to that position, mostly relating to the CCG sector, and this is the focus of our so-called deep dive review. It would be fair to say that the work to date on that review indicates that while recovery actions already underway will ensure that not all of the 444 million of commissioning risk will crystallise, a substantial proportion of it probably will. So as well as trying to steer that number down to the lowest possible level by supporting CCGs to take the required action to correct that position, we're also redoubling our efforts to find additional mitigations amongst our central budgets. We remain absolutely committed to delivering a balanced position across the commissioning sector. There is no question about that being our intent and our resolve, and I very much expect that when I come back to you in a couple of months' time at our next meeting, I'll be able to describe how the combined impact of all of those actions, the corrective actions in the CCG sector, the controls that we've got tightly in place around expenditure on our direct commissioning budgets, and the additional mitigations in central budgets, I will hope that the combination of those things will enable me to show you how we're going to deliver on the commitment that we have to deliver a balanced bottom line. I can assure you right now there is no stone being left unturned in the pursuit of that goal. Meanwhile, as I note in my report, our colleagues in NHS Improvement are working flat out with trusts around the country to ensure that the actions we signalled back in July in the so-called reset document have the maximum possible impact in securing and where possible improving on the 580 million deficit plan that they've agreed with providers and heading down towards the 250 million achievement which they have set out for themselves. Again, that process is not yet complete and work continues both with the first cohort of providers put into special measures and with a wider group of providers with cost growth issues to address. So we'll have to wait a few weeks before we know where that is going to land. So all in all, a year which was always going to be exceptionally challenging is living up to our expectations, at least in that respect. Across the commissioning sector, we can draw on the strengths of the financial management approach that we've evolved over our first 3 years of operation, but there's still a hell of a lot to do, and that stuff has got to be done in combination with the work that we've been talking about already this morning on STPs and landing the longer term plans and on gearing up for the operating plan process, which again we've discussed. So major activity around the country to secure the financial position alongside the longer term work that we've been discussing already. On which happy note, I'll pause for questions or even better, contributions, monetary or otherwise, from colleagues around the table.
Thank you very much, Paul, for your usual clarity and the lack of sunny uplands. Always characterises your report. Let me invite David, please.
Yeah, I just think the board should be aware the commissioning committee went through the numbers with Paul in some depth and would support everything that he said. I think the point that is self-evident is that the risk is probably as high as we've seen it, and therefore there is a lot of work needed to be done to reduce that risk and mitigate it. But Paul and the team have a real good grip on the detail and on the drivers, and therefore of cost and how they manage themselves through into the numbers, and therefore I think we can be reassured that all the right things are being done.
I would agree with that. I think the other pillar is the relationship with NHS Improvement, which is just so different from that which we had only 1 year ago. And the close working relationship, which I know exists across our organisations, is going to be absolutely critical to delivering what we need to deliver. So I think that continues to be work in progress to continue to build on what we've achieved already. Let me invite any further observations or comments on Paul's report. No, well, thank you, Paul.